Lastly, we have Nano Server and Windows containers. Windows container is exactly what you're thinking. It is Docker. Nano Server, used for your small little deployments like a Hyper-V container host, a web server, a DNS server, something tiny. They have no traditional user interface. It's very straightforward because it's Nano. It's supposed to do one little thing. It'll have only the roles, features, services, and drivers needed to do the task. So it'll have low resource utilization. And it has higher security because it has very few services and drivers running. Installing Nano is not an option like you would with like Server Core. It's actually a virtual disk. And you can install certain roles while it's running. So just like Server Core, it needs some default stuff. But the Nano servers will use less than this. You will need the installation media so that it can generate these Nano servers. And you can kind of save that information on your drive to create later. And then you can do something like import module to create images. That'll turn into these little Nano servers. So here we're making a new Nano server image. It'll be a guest edition data center. That's where we want the file to be created and its name. So it'll come with a couple of parameters that you'll need to provide. And then we can set things like the deployment type, any drivers, the Hyper-V role if we need it. You can install Nano Server on a physical computer and have things like dual boot, Pixie, or WinPE. Any advanced roles that you can add are these: storage, compute, defender, cluster, containers, and packages. Why would you install Nano Server on hardware and not just use Hyper-V in a Nano? Well, if you have a small system and you want it to do a specific job, then you could use Nano Server. So if you have let's say you need a DNS server, but you have a desktop around and your other servers are doing other things, well, you could pop it up easily as a Nano server. It's small enough that it can run on even old systems. It's versatile because it's so small that you don't need to install even Hyper-V. Because with Hyper-V, you need virtualization. With Nano, you don't. It's basically like the yeah. I don't know if I would say it's the Linux of the Windows only world. I'd say it's more of the it's like getting a very minimal install. Yeah, like Alpine Linux, something really minimal. It's a minimal Windows, even more minimal than Server Core. Here you go, some PowerShells. More PowerShell. So for example, we can install a Nano Server with SCVMM and the compute package. We could install a Nano Server to be our file server. We install a Nano Server to be a web server. Command line is old. So as you have noticed in this course, it's all about PowerShell. Now, PowerShell can do a lot more than command prompt could do anyway, which is why we don't really spend any time talking about the command line. Because PowerShell is more like the bash, where you can do anything and everything. Yes. CMD comes from DOS. That's where you found it first. So just like with a lot of other roles in your standard Windows installs, adding a package doesn't do much other than give you the package. You still have to enable the features and configure them. So your work is not done just because you created a Nano server and you installed a feature. Cool. Still have to do configuration like always. Now here we're enabling a DNS server. And we'll have to set this stuff up. So some common configuration parameters that you'll see when working with Nano Server: the deployment type, the edition, the max size, any drivers, admin password, domain path, and blob path. We can configure IP addressing, the subnet mask. So that'll definitely be necessary. You can join a Nano server to a domain, to the same one as the host system or a different domain. It'll be an offline domain where it'll join the domain without having to contact the controller. Normally, you have to be on the network and have it authenticate, and then it'll be part of the network, but Nano can do it without. And you would use the domain name, the dash domain name, to join it. No, but since it's doing it offline, still make sure that it's accessible and that you have the rights to do so. If you have a domain blob, you can do that too. Kind of like file sharing and whatnot. And some more options that you can add in your configuration. So it makes it into one really long string. Like one really long string. You can edit server images after they've been made. Not everything can get changed after the fact. Like these 4 cannot be changed afterwards. But you can update them. as needed. Now, this last section is about containers. And it is definitely talking about Docker. I will say right off the bat, Docker can be a monster to use. It can also be a very big security threat because most people don't check the Docker image that they download before they run it. And it is very easy for attackers to take a legitimate Docker image, inject malicious code, and have an easy backdoor that nobody checked. So when using containers from a public place like Docker Hub, please make sure that you test. Please make sure that you verify, because it is very easy for an attacker to gain access through containers because they're normally not checked. So a container is a software environment that is isolated, but is still part of the OS that it's running from. It is, in a way, self-contained, but it's also part of the host. Like the Nano Server, they're very small. They can be used to do a certain task. Easy to be built up and brought down. Kubernetes uses containers to quickly spin up VMs to handle a large load of traffic, for example, of browsing traffic. That's how big sites like Google and Amazon and whatnot they can handle, because they have multiple servers to take those requests. So yeah, when you want something for a fast deployment without worrying about dependencies, has several lightweight components, load management, that's where Dockers can come in just fine. You can deploy containers on anything that has server experience, the core and Nano. With any of them all, you'll need to install Docker. You can use Server Manager to install containers on desktop experience. And you can use PowerShell to do so. You can use Hyper-V as well to manage them if you have the role. Then you would install Docker to your system. And you'll know it's installed when you see Dockerd running. Then you can install a base OS for the Docker client. And then make server containers. I have not had much success running Docker in Windows. I've had a lot of issues. Anyone here have a better experience with Windows and Docker? Yeah, I tend to just use it within Linux. Not so much in Windows. I tried it like once or twice and just got frustrated that it wasn't working right. But it can be done. You can create Hyper-V containers, and this is something I haven't done. Okay, yeah, I use Windows with Docker sometimes, but only with Linux-based images, not Windows, yeah. You can also implement containers on Nano. You would just specify the containers parameter or add it after the fact. Once the feature is installed, then you can install a Docker on Nano Server. And then you'll enter that session, and then from there be able to create your Docker containers. There's a number of configurable options in this file that is sitting in this folder that you would have to go into to configure. And here are some tips and tricks with Windows Container. So you have your Docker commands that you typically see on any system. To see the running containers, to stop one, or sorry, to delete, to stop, to start, to get a command line. That's pretty standard across any Docker system. Now you can list them, you can tag them, you can remove, commit changes to images, just like you would do on Linux. It's the same. Giving systems tags. Commit any changes to the container, so any new container will have that new update. And of course, remove. All of Docker uses NAT by default. And you can change the configuration when you create containers. This is also true of doing it anywhere. You can change the default network in the daemon.json file. Normally, you don't need to do this. Oops. Normally, you don't need to do this, but you can. It's really the thing about this is you can go into that file, that JSON file, and change these settings if you so want. You can do port mapping, which again, you can do on any. So if you've ever interacted with Docker, you have these same settings. You can do a transparent network, a layer 2 bridge network as well. That way, your container is on the same network as your host, so you're not using that anymore. You're basically bridging. Container volumes just is the same in any system that has Docker. Specify where they are and get to them. The resources you can limit. So if you don't want a specific Docker to have full access to the CPU, you want to give it 5%, 10% or whatever, you can definitely do that. Yep, there are PowerShell commands that work exactly like the Docker. To me, this was more confusing. So Docker exec, for example, the equivalent in PowerShell is this. Commit container image. So I was like, what? Docker run is push container image. Docker pull load container image, I guess. But pull container image is Docker push. Yeah, it's a little weird. And get more. I would just use the Docker ones because those are universal. Moving right along. Go on GitHub and you'll find tons of Docker files that you can use to create a Docker image and use Docker build to build them. These are some of the basic commands you'll find within a Docker file. And you say Docker build, and it'll read that file and execute those commands to build out your image. Pretty awesome. A Docker Hub is a public repository that you can, anyone with an account can upload. Again, this is what I was talking about, being careful, because it is very easy to for a malicious person to add some stuff and get yourself in trouble. Always test before you download a Docker image. You can also use Azure or Azure, however that is supposed to be pronounced, to get your Docker images and use them up on the cloud. For Docker, I highly suggest this link. Really, to get started on Docker, you can download it yourself. You can also play with Docker in a cloud-based environment, which would be my suggestion. If you've never played with Docker before, definitely do. It's a tech that isn't going away anytime soon. So I would say click play with Docker, create an account if you haven't, and go through the tutorial to learn how to use Docker. It's free and it's good knowledge to have anyway. So I suggest taking some time and just doing the 101. If you have no experience with Docker whatsoever, I suggest get some simple experience that's already provided by the Docker folks. Any questions? Okay. And I'll stop the recording.